Good afternoon, everybody. It's very nice to meet you. In this forum. I would have loved to meet you, of course, in person with a cup of tea at this time on Saturday afternoon. But I think we need to wait for a while for that. I think I also want to congratulate you up front on yesterday's World Environment Day. This was a very strange World Environment Day. For the first time, we could not perhaps easily go out into the forest or enjoy somewhere nature. But I just want to say, pay my first tribute to beautiful Malaysia and its wonderful nature that is the pride of the globe, and many, many countries envy Malaysia for that and for many other things. So I want to kind of extend a thank you to the Islamic Renaissance Front for the invitation. And I thought, because it is not straightforward to communicate through this virtual kind of media, I have kind of prepared a presentation that I will use as a structure to kind of deliver my remarks, so that perhaps it is easier to communicate. Pauline, can you please already kind of move to the second slide? I thought I structure my remarks today in 5 different kind of chapters, if you want. I want to take maybe 5 minutes on each of these. I think it's always important to be clear about the goal, and therefore all the SDGs as a coin and as a very famous kind of development paradigm, but there are a few subtleties that I wanted to kind of discuss with you. Then I go quickly into the discussion of where the SDGs were before COVID started. Then the third issue, then I will deep dive into the COVID-19 impact on the SDGs, and pull somehow the global picture in the 4th chapter a little bit into the Malaysian context. I will kind of always move back and forth between the global context and Malaysia, because I am, of course, appointed here as the resident coordinator for Malaysia. So my main job is to help the country with the staff and resources of 19 United Nations agencies that are partly in the country and partly are working from outside the country in different projects. And then finally, very briefly, I will kind of talk a little bit about the UN in Malaysia and the response. So please, let's move to the next 2 slides. I'm starting with the famous icons of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, but want to draw your attention to the kind of headings on the side. I think you all know that the core of the SDGs is the balance between social, economic, and environmental development. Ehsan rightly pointed out that this is the next generation of goals set by the international community between 2015 and 2030, following on the Millennium Development Goals. There were only 8. There was only 1 environmental goal. In fact, now we have, arguably here we see 4, but 7, affordable and clean energy, obviously is also very much related to environment. Sustainable cities is very much related to environment. So there is 4 full-scale goals for on the environment, and several others basically have targets that very much relate to the environment. And then there is this very new goal in there, and that is the goal 16 on the bottom of the page, on governance and peace. This is something completely new because so far this followed different tracks in the United Nations system. If you want, this is for the first time a comprehensive framework of development, which recognizes that good governance and rights also are the precondition to deliver on these 3 very important dimensions: social, economic, and environment. Next, please. As you know, the point of this slide is not only that they are universally endorsed by all 193 UN member countries, but that they also are expected to be delivered by the countries as such. So it is true that the United Nations plays a very important driver role to make these Sustainable Development Goals happen. But the expectation is, of course, that the goals cannot be achieved if the UN kind of drives them alone. The key driver is the 193 governments. It is everybody is in charge of these goals, and the beauty of this framework is that it relates as much to developed countries as it does to developing countries. This is also different from the Millennium Development Goals, which was a framework that focused on developing countries only. Next, please. The SDG model, I mentioned already that the SDG 16, good governance, is a key new feature. And it is very important and cannot be overemphasized that we are talking here also as part of development. We're talking about security, we're talking about rule of law, anti-corruption, about accountable institutions, and also fundamental freedoms. And this is part, as important, a part of the SDGs as is climate change or poverty reduction. Of course, everything is, if you want, focused on poverty reduction and on two principles. And these are, on the one hand, leave no one behind. So we look at development from a clear equity lens. We are looking at making sure that those that have so far, for different reasons, been excluded from the mainstream of development, make it into the mainstream of development. And the United Nations, of course, lends its analytical, resources to kind of revealing who these people that are left behind are, to help governments that the right policies are put in place. The other principle is sustainability. So environmental sustainability runs across the SDGs. And I want to stress this because this presentation looks at, among others, Malaysian development and also global development from these two principles and good governance. So it's important, basically, I will not cover the whole economy. Many countries are doing a lot of work on economic recovery. I will, of course, touch on it, but I will focus especially on leaving no one behind and also on sustainability issues, including also good governance. The SDGs are accompanied by a comprehensive measurement framework. 232 indicators tell us that how we are doing and how we can better target, because they are also kind of disaggregated with regard to different groups of people. Next, please. I'm coming to the second chapter, where the SDGs on track before COVID-19 struck. And this is a graph about the situation of the Sustainable Development Goals in the Asia Pacific. It comes from UNSDGs, the regional UN organization in Bangkok. And as you can easily see here, the 2018 targets was not reached. This is from from early 2019, so 2018 is the timing when the data basically was provided. None of the 17 goals was on track at that time, with a few of the goals, including especially responsible consumption and production, number 12, but also decent work, goal 8, and clean water and sanitation, actually in reverse kind of direction. And on the right side of the graph, you see that where the targets would be if we were to go with the same speed until 2030. The green diamonds are where we would reach by 2030, and you can see that again we would be far away from achieving the Sustainable Development Goal on a regional level. Now let's look very briefly at Malaysia. Next slide. Malaysia, this is a tricky slide because it consists on the top of blue bars and then in the bottom mostly of light blue and light red bars, which means that there is not enough data that provides sufficient evidence of the progress. We are working with the Department of Statistics of Malaysia to kind of generate this data. These are very complex data sets that in many countries need to first be kind of identified. But what you can see is that in terms of decent work, contrary to many of the countries in the region, Malaysia is doing very well. So it does on good health and well-being, and also in other several dimensions, it does quite well. But others are kind of presumed going backwards, but usually because of a lack of data sets. Next. It is clear, however, that Malaysia, like any other country in the world, has to make major efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And that is related to the fact that there are simply very ambitious set of goals, and that they are much larger in scope than any other goal set before. Some of the issues that are in the process to be addressed is not only dealing with the poverty line, because the extreme poverty in Malaysia has more or less been eradicated, but we are in the SDGs looking for pockets of poverty and inequalities, and of course there are such pockets of poverty and inequalities, including with vulnerable groups. Social protection system in comparison to other countries in the same development stage is not quite at the same level. We know about the issue of malnutrition and obesity, the so-called non-communicable diseases, or NDCs, which play a very important role in the Sustainable Development Goals. Gender inequality is an issue like there's no country in the world that has full gender equality, and so is gender-based violence, which is equally prevalent all over. We don't know a single society that does not have gender-based violence, but the efforts, of course, are to reduce it dramatically. It's really another pandemic. We have an environmentally unsustainable pathway of growth in Malaysia, as also in many other countries. I mean, the most famous dimension of that is, of course, climate change. And there's a long way to go to rectify this. Decent work and labor protection issues are still an issue, although I mentioned in the last slide that there's relatively good progress, but I think what is not included here are migrant workers. And as everybody knows, I think this is still an issue to be addressed. And so is some elements of governance, human rights, and social cohesion issues, which are, as I said, a part of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the message here is that COVID-19 crisis has deepened all of these shortcomings and threatens the very good progress made, because I want to say that Malaysia, in comparison to many other countries, is of course very often quoted as an example of poverty reduction, of the rollout of access to services, and so on. Next, please. So here this goes a bit further into certain issues, poverty, gender, education. I don't think we need to dwell on this too much. Maybe you can jump over this at the next slide. We have energy issues, access to energy in some rural areas. We have a big, I think, a slew of environmental issues to target under the environmental goals. Next, I'm coming now to chapter 3. And chapter 3 really goes now into the COVID-19 crisis, and I tried to kind of draw a narrative of these goals. And I have to start with the current situation. Now, this is a few days old. We are now at 6 million plus cases. Actually, but today it's 6.8 million cases. That means that This is only 4 days old. There are almost 800,000 additional cases in the worldwide of COVID-19. The focus of the crisis, as you all know, has now shifted somewhat from Europe to the Americas. So, for example, Brazil, that 4 days ago was still on place number 5 in the very, very sad statistics of the cumulative death, is today already on rank number 3. Has kind of moved ahead of Spain and Italy. And there is, as we all know, a clear link between, how quickly the social distancing measures were adopted and how the crisis exploded in terms of cases and also death. Next. This is a world map about the current reporting, and this is the last 24 hours, but it is a few days old, but this map would look, I think, very similar also yesterday. Cases reported as a share of 1 million population. The darker the green, the more cases you have. And what is, I think, very positive from our side is that Malaysia and also the region, at least the north of Malaysia, is white, which means that there is very few cases as part of the total population reported in comparison to other countries. Next. The COVID-19 epidemic curve, you have seen this. There is, I think it must be the best reported crisis ever in the history of mankind, because every newspaper in the world publishes, I think, the situation on a daily basis, and so it is very well published. But it shows here the cumulative amount of cases, and in orange it is the active cases that have flattened out and or gone back. So the picture in comparison to other countries in terms of the health response, I think, is seen as very successful, as we all know. Next. But we are not only dealing with a health crisis, we are dealing with a triple crisis. And this triple crisis, as we all know, is a crisis of health, the crisis of economics, and the crisis of social issues. First was the health crisis, and the health crisis, and I said I would talk about leaving no one behind, so I will look at it from a differentiated point of view. Some groups of people have been hit much harder by the health crisis, such as women, since they have 70% of the healthcare jobs worldwide. The elderly, as we all know, much bigger prevalence of the disease, and also even much higher death rate. But also those that don't have, and please can you go to the next slide, also those that lack access to information, those groups that are excluded from the mainstream of information, also of testing and treatments. And these are, and this is not only Malaysia, but it's internationally. These are often the irregular migrant workers, undocumented and stateless persons, but also those that are geographically isolated persons and children with disabilities, and those that in countries where testing and healthcare has a price tag, those that cannot simply not afford it. And of course, the fourth group that is affected, more than any other of the health crisis, is those that are in institutions, in detention centers, in prison, and can, for simple physical reasons, not avail of social distancing approaches. So a much higher risk of spreading is there. In terms of the economic crisis, I think it is important to point out that this economic crisis has now overtaken almost the health crisis. although I don't want to compare, but in a simple kind of impact on human development, it is absolutely massive. We all know that it started through a production disruption in China, and because 20% of all consumer goods and global trade is manufactured in China, this immediately led to a disruption of value chains. Then came the global, almost synchronized lockdown, and began to undercut consumption, and this then led to a dramatic downward spiral, so that ILO, for example, expects by now that 6.7% of working hours globally were lost in the last 2 months, and this is equivalent to 195 million full-time jobs. 125 million of those are in Asia. And it didn't take a long time until 27th of March. This was only the 10th day of our MCO when IMF declared that the world is in recession. Now the estimates are that recession this year will be between 2.2 to 3% negative growth in the global economy. And of course that then goes hand in hand with dramatic financial sustainability issues of countries, but also of companies within countries, corporate institutions inside the countries, which result in almost a dramatic effect of job loss, in plunging investor confidence and liquidity issues. So we are experiencing the worst financial crisis in living history. And the third consecutive crisis was the social crisis. Because of an unprecedented loss of jobs and incomes, especially with regard to the informal sector, which had an especially devastating impact on the poor and near poor. We will get into this in a moment. Migrants, undocumented refugees were especially affected. People are on the move. 100 million people are on the move in India, and I don't think we are by far yet have not gone through the worst yet. We also have experienced a care crisis, which because of the significant higher burden on women was again a differential effect on women and girls. And we've also in many countries seen an unraveling of social harmony because of hate speech issue, because of xenophobia, because of social cohesion problems and challenges. Malaysia, of course, next slide. Malaysia, of course, is also hit, but not, I don't think, in comparison to many other countries. I think we can confidently say that the country has done quite well, certainly in the public health response, but also through a number of stimulus packages, so that hopefully much of the impact is cushioned off. Only yesterday, the Prime Minister mentioned that unemployment may go up to 5.5%. I think many countries would love that figure, but nevertheless, for Malaysia, it's definitely still a huge tragedy. And it just shows that the whole world is affected. And in a globalized world like today, of course, no country can insulate itself. It's so much interdependence between countries that even if their own country is doing well, there are multiple interrelations with other countries. But also in Malaysia, there have been massive impacts at the expense of vulnerable groups. And we have, from the UN side, looked at the differentiated impact on 9 groups, namely low-income households, women, refugees, undocumented, stateless, and asylum seekers, migrants, children, the elderly, people and children living with disabilities, indigenous, and homeless. So all of these groups had already their vulnerabilities before the crisis, And as I mentioned before in my quick kind of record keeping of the SDGs before COVID, it has been exacerbated. The vulnerabilities have been exacerbated. And I don't think we have time to go probably deeply into these vulnerabilities. But just to say that what we all know, that many people in Malaysia have been really dramatically affected by this crisis. Next slide, please. And now we are always talking about the new normal. We are taking the new normal almost for granted already. And the question is, of course, is this new normal, can we, in all this slump and in all this depression and in all this hardship, also find opportunities? I will introduce in a moment the UN view on this. So our new normal basically consists of higher inequality, higher unemployment, higher poverty, and possibly higher carbon emissions if once the economy fully bounces back and follows the trajectory of recent years, then also carbon emission will further go up, which with all its impact on climate change. And from the UN side, we are asking, are we resigned to having the new normal as given, or can we shape this new normal as a shared future, as a stronger, even stronger model with stronger inclusiveness and stronger sustainability as part of a comprehensive development model? As we all know, it is very clear historically that the best innovations and the best policy changes, the most fundamental policy changes, have come out indeed from crisis. And therefore, we are advocating to really kind of not take the status quo for granted, but to really kind of challenge and move dynamically with better policies, instead of even better policies, into a bold new future, into a paradigm shift. Now, I have already said that the government commendably has introduced already 3 stimulus packages, including the one yesterday. So I will look more at the UN response and give you a quick overview of how it's designed globally and how we then fine-tune it towards the different countries. So the Secretary General in April, about a few weeks ago, has published what is called the UN Framework for Immediate Socioeconomic Response to COVID-19. And this report, these guidelines, are guidelines to all 131 United Nations country teams that are posted in different countries, including the one in Malaysia. And it is really a very kind of easy to read and convincing report. You can find it on the web if you are interested. I encourage you to just Google UN Framework Socioeconomic Response, then you will find it. And it is part of a three-pronged response to COVID-19 of the United Nations system. Number one, the health response, which was led by WHO. Again, I mean, we have to always consider that there is an enormous variety of countries, of course, on this globe, and different agencies will have different roles. The weaker, let's say, the institutional capacities of a country, the stronger usually the role has to be of the United Nations. In Malaysia, we are, I think, very fortunate to have very strong institutional capacity. So the UN is supporting here and there, but again, a three-pronged approach: health, humanitarian response, and based on the so-called global humanitarian response plan, and then a so-called SocioEconomic Response Framework, which came after, obviously. This was sequential: first health, then humanitarian, then SocioEconomic response. And this is an integrated support package that is offered by the United Nations Development System, of which I have the honor to be the head in Malaysia with the 19 agencies that I have mentioned. Now, I will focus not on health and humanitarian, but on socioeconomic response framework, because this is what we at the moment are doing. We have already worked on health and humanitarian response in the recent month. Next, please. And this is an integrated, this socioeconomic response is an integrated package, which is built on 5 pillars, if you want. Number 1, health first, then social protection. Number 3, economic response and recovery. Number 4, macroeconomic response and multilateral collaboration. And number 5, good governance, that's social cohesion and community resilience. And depending again on the needs and the cooperation between the United Nations and different countries, different pillars have more prominence than others. In this framework, we very much advocate that we have to keep the SDGs firmly in mind, that social protection is an absolute centerpiece. We know from many countries the single biggest element of avoiding people falling back into poverty is a strong social protection system. We are also, what I mentioned, combining a health and an economic solution response. And we are also using or advocating to use this new normal as a chance to recalibrate certain policy choices, especially towards low carbon economy, such as digital transition and green transition. And with this, I come now to very briefly to 10, let's say, recommendations that we are currently kind of reflecting on, and I would like to test some of these with you. Next slide, please. I will not go through all the 10, but this is kind of coming very much from the global guidance, and as I said, we still need to kind of fine tune this. But in our analysis, some of these would be also worth having a very close look by Malaysia. It starts with the obvious, creating a fiscal space, and this is a major challenge in a time when the fiscal pressure is quite enormous. But again, the government has repurposed existing resources to enhance the fiscal space already through its 3 stimulus packages. But there are many kind of approaches that countries take, such as introduce new progressive taxation systems, such as tackling what we call tax termites. That means companies that for some reason have special tax kind of privileges that are not anymore timely. So the purpose here is to really re-examine the revenue side and also cut down on spending that may not be so necessary at the moment, to really kind of repurpose it towards the most important issues, namely we believe that is towards the poor, towards the vulnerable, and obviously also towards the economy and the environment. So in Malaysia, we have a number of innovative financing sources as well, and one of the big ones is of course Islamic financing, which would be another source of funding that if further rolled out could work for these purposes. My second point is social protection. I already mentioned that the quality of social protection systems, both before and during, if it's strengthened during a crisis, are the single most important criterion to avoid a dramatic increase in poverty. This we know from, for example, the 2008 financial crisis. And we note with appreciation that globally the social protection response is unparalleled. It has never been as robust as in this crisis. And we do believe that in Malaysia there is still scope to improve the social protection system, targeting issues, issues of the missing middle, where many people that are actually in employment are not part of an insurance scheme, employment insurance scheme, for example. And we are suggesting here to support what is already there in the blueprint of social protection blueprint, namely a more kind of extensive life cycle based social protection. Then I come towards the third issue, and that is the inclusion of vulnerable non-nationals, especially undocumented. We believe that in the current situation, inclusion of undocumented migrants pays off. Our message is don't put migrants in detention and don't threaten them with deportation, because we know that they are an important part of the labor force, and only an inclusive public health and an inclusive socioeconomic response will help us in the end suppress the virus and restart our economies. So the United Nations encourages an inclusive approach to contain the virus and include migrants in non-discriminatory, non-threatening policies. This is coming directly from the Secretary General. This is global policy. We are concerned that the migrants that are being detained and deported are in fear of coming forward and get tested, and that's why some countries have the situation that they have, namely massive infection rates, basically because of people being in detention. And we have communicated this also to the appropriate authorities. We also advocate that there should be no penalty to return home. Some migrants would like to go home, and but they fear that going to detention and comes with the health risks and the condition that detention brings. So we encourage an amnesty for undocumented migrants and fees to be waived, so that migrants can travel to their home countries. And over time, we also believe that there needs to be a major issue, a major kind of effort, and we know that there have been many rounds of trying that, but to regularize undocumented migrants in the essential workforce. We believe that many migrants are not undocumented voluntarily, but are actually victims of certain situations, and it is in the interest of the country to move them into documented status, including through strong incentives, so that there can be really a better management of this very critical group of people for the economy, and also, of course, from a rights perspective. Then I go to two that I think I don't need to kind of elaborate, because they have been very well covered in the stimulus packages, including in yesterday's, namely stimulus for SMEs and also rebuilding the workforce. So I will not talk about these two. I just want to say that I especially liked some of the innovative initiatives in terms of rebuilding the workforce, gig economy, reskilling and upgrading program. There was a lot yesterday in the package, which I found was really kind of an interesting stimulus for rebuilding the workforce. But what I would like to stress is that there needs to be a differentiated response for women. That's my sixth recommendation here. We know that women are differently affected. I have already talked about the burden of care, about the fact that they have usually the more low-paying and informal jobs. That's why there need to be different social protection solutions for women and also benefits for children. Also, the issue of gender-based violence is one that needs additional support, although I understand that there have been good efforts during the movement control order and before, like so in so many other areas. Number 7, and I come now into the 2 recommendations that have to do with governance, and I'm very soon ending my presentation also here, and thank you so much for your attention. One is freedom of media. We think it cannot be overemphasized how important this is, and Malaysia has made very good progress in the last years, and we hope that this will continue in the right track, including the repealing of some of the laws that limit freedom of media. We believe that this is an integral part of stimulating democracy, stimulating inclusive development, and an accountable government. So a hugely important area. Number 8, improve social cohesion. When I came to Malaysia, I of course knew that Malaysia was known for its unity and diversity and its highly compassionate society. And that's why the recent rise in hate speech and xenophobia against refugees and also the undocumented migrants came as a surprise. I think this needs to be tackled, because what has been shown in other countries is that these issues of lack of solidarity with vulnerable people can easily spill over to other groups and can undermine the social cohesion of a society. So we need to promote regulatory measures also to stem hate speech, but of course there needs to be a balance, very important, without threatening freedom of expression. And my 2 final recommendations, to build an even kind of better Malaysia in the future. Again, dwelling on the opportunity that we are in a time of disruption and have the luxury to reimagine perhaps the path that we are going. These last 2 recommendations are related to environment. One is to mobilize fiscal stimuli for greening. There has been a lot done for greening the economy, and greening the country. A lot has been done in Malaysia in terms of environmental projects, but I think this is the chance to use also fiscal mechanisms to systematize this. And I know this is not popular with some people, but I'm nevertheless mentioning it here. Fuel subsidies, even in a country that gets a huge income from petrocarbons, is unsustainable, and there should be consideration to remove fuel subsidies. Otherwise, you will always have a market failure, and because petrol is overconsumed and carbon is over emitted. And over time, we believe that globally this needs to be linked to pricing carbon emission, so coming in with a carbon tax. And all of this, of course, has to go hand in hand with many investment packages to stimulate renewable energy and energy efficiency in the different relevant sectors. And last but not least, my 10th is not to forget, in this time of tight fiscal kind of landscape, not to forget the other areas of the economy, especially because, again, I come back to yesterday's Environment Day, the absolute importance of biodiversity, given that Malaysia is one of the 10 mega biodiverse countries. You are sitting on an asset, on a huge asset that I think will only be, the value of which will only be discovered in the next decades, and that's the rainforest. But of course also the tropical seas. And Malaysia has done a lot, but you know, a lot more is needed to really kind of look properly after the biodiversity, because what we are at the moment in is a dramatic attrition towards biodiversity and an extinction of 10,000s of species. So this brings me to the end of my 10 recommendations, and to a very quick epilogue, namely the role of UN Malaysia. We have worked with government and other actors in 3 phases. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide. In an immediate response, which focused on more humanitarian support, I can tell you that because Malaysia is an upper middle income country, it is not easy to attract humanitarian resources to Malaysia. But we have kind of put together one plan, and we are expecting hopefully an allocation of resources very soon. Then we have a medium-term response, and this is the socioeconomic response plan, which I have talked about. You know, the recommendations were part of those. They will kind of be considered as part of this 12 to 18 months long socioeconomic response plan. And finally, there is a very robust relationship with the government of Malaysia and with other partners. Again, Malaysia is such a vibrant environment in terms of policy making. I really would like to take this opportunity to express my profound kind of happiness about the experience in Malaysia. And one of the reasons is also the really vibrant NGO sector. And we pride ourselves to have excellent relationships, not only with the government, but also with the NGO sector, with also the private sector. And some of the initiatives that are here listed in the longer term response, you know, they all kind of look at a whole of nation approach to mobilize, you know, government, private sector, NGOs for the Sustainable Development Goals. And very soon, our 5-year framework will be approved, and this will be from 2021 to 2025, accompanying the 12th Malaysia Plan, the so-called difficult acronym UNSDGs. It stands for United Nations Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework. And many other activities are going on, SDG roadmaps, a monitoring system, and of course, a sizable program portfolio of the 19 United Nations agencies to address specific SDG gaps and acceleration opportunities. With this, I thank you very much for being with me in the whole presentation, and I look forward to some questions. Thank you.